Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Canada Hoops. It's your boy Matty. Thank you for your continued support. Please keep downloading and sharing us. Visit our YouTube channel. Hit us up on Instagram and X.com. Our guest today represents Toronto, Ontario. He is the dedicated Toronto Raptors reporter for TSN. You find him on tsn.ca and TSN Radio 1050 in Toronto. And he also covers Canada basketball. He is Josh Lewenberg. Josh, thank you so much for joining us on Canada Hoops, man.
Thanks for having me on, Maddie. Happy to be here.
Yeah, appreciate it. Looking forward to it. I know, if anyone's watching the Raptors throughout the season, and obviously Canada basketball news and in their time in the summer, people know your work. You're kind of everywhere. So, and I know it's a busy time. Just how are things, man? We're halfway almost through the Raptors season, the NBA season. Just talk about maybe the grind that it is right now, man.
Yeah, well, I think it's probably getting a little bit busier leading up to the trade deadline, which is coming fast. This is sort of like the calm before the storm. We're already hearing like the Jimmy Butler rumblings around the league and a few other guys that have popped up, but I'm sure it's going to get crazier as it tends to do as we get closer to February 6th. But yeah, I mean, we just hit game number 41 for the Raptors, so literally halfway. It seems like it's gone by pretty quickly here, especially considering I think like going into this Raptors season, nobody really knew what to expect. We knew that they wouldn't be great and that this would be a rebuilding season, but obviously coming off of the tail end of last season where Barnes was hurt, Pirtle was hurt, and some of those games are really, really ugly and painful. I think there was probably some skepticism going into this season, not just about like the record and the actual result, but like what is this team going to look like? And the fact that outside of like a short, brief span over the last month, there was like a 2-week span where things got pretty grim, a lot of blowouts. Outside of that stretch, this has actually been a pretty fun bad team. Like,
right.
And they're losing games, which you could argue is best for the long-term health of this organization, but they're doing it in a way, certainly, that's not embarrassing the franchise during their 30th anniversary season. They've been, for the most part, fun and competitive and entertaining, and we've seen some growth from the young guys. So in that sense, it's kind of been a little bit refreshing as a reporter to be covering a young rebuilding team after the last 2 years where we were sort of just stuck in limbo a little bit.
Right. Yeah, I noticed like, from afar in another city, like they are a fun team. Like, we pretty much have them on every night in the house here. And, I would imagine there's that sense of excitement is very real. There's been obviously some really cool stretches through the season with RJ Barrett having a great year, and despite the injuries to others and the recent play of Chris Boucher has been, kind of electric off the bench and something for everyone to rally around. Like, the trade deadline is looming, like you said. Do you anticipate Masai Ujiri, Bobby Webster making some moves to just look at some long-term growth or help this team? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would be a little bit surprised if they sat this one out and didn't do anything. But at the same time, like, I'm not expecting fireworks in the same way that I was the last 2 years. Now, 2 years ago, we didn't really get those fireworks. We expected, I think a lot of people did around the league, expected them to go out and do something big and to be sellers and maybe clean house then. And instead, they actually went out and were buyers and got Jakob Pirtle. And the success of that trade varies depending on who you talk to. Obviously, he's turned into a really good player for this team, but I think a lot of people look back and wonder, well, why were they buying in that situation? Last year was completely different. Last year, of course, they actually went out and they were sellers. And look, I think they did their heavy lifting last year. There isn't that much for people expecting a fire sale this year. Like there's not much more to sell. They're obviously not going to move on they're not going to trade anybody from their young core. And right now, this team is mostly the young core. Right. So, yeah, I think you look at the veterans that are left on this team. I mentioned Pirtle. I would be surprised if they traded Pirtle. There's going to be interest around the league, and I'm sure it's something that they'll at least consider. But to this point, from what I've heard, like they've been really, really reluctant. Their asking price is high, and that's sort of been the MO of this front office over the years is they ask for a lot for the players they value, and they really, really value Pirtle. They see him as somebody who, once this rebuild takes the next step over the coming years and hopefully next year, and they're looking to be a little bit more competitive, he's the type of veteran player they think that can help them take them there. So I don't see Pirtle going anywhere, and that leaves Boucher, Bruce Brown, Kelly Olynyk, two Canadians, is expiring. Well, outside of Kelly, the other two are on expiring deals. Guys that are in the latter part of their career that probably don't fit the timeline here. So just based on like the caliber of player that I mentioned there, at least where they are in their career, you're probably not expecting to get very much for those guys, like maybe second round picks. Or I guess what could be more interesting potentially, and I know Doug Smith put this out there, Toronto Star put this out there the other day, is that because they have a bunch of expiring contracts, and Bruce Brown at $23 million expiring is a pretty high number, gives them some flexibility to maybe be a facilitator in a bigger trade. If Jimmy Butler is going to go somewhere, maybe they help as like the third or fourth team in that situation. I could totally see that happening. But all of that is to say, like, I think for the most part, this core is the way that it is for now, and I don't expect any major changes to that over the next 3 weeks.
Yeah, agreed. And I thought, like, I've seen the Chris Boucher, Kelly Olynyk name out there, and just from a Canada standpoint, and Kelly's interesting because I think he's a valuable vet that teams would look at, and I know Kelly's enjoyed his time in Toronto, obviously, and it'll be interesting to see if he gets moved. And I would personally like to see him maybe get an opportunity on a contender where, he's playing
that role. Games.
Yeah, he has, right? And
years.
I think he's really carved a role in a league for this long where, it'd be cool to see him get an opportunity to really go deep. Do you think that's why maybe Chris has elevated his play as of late too, because he knows he's possibly on the market and wants to be somewhat more attractive? And I know Darko's kind of gone to him earlier off the bench and increased minutes. There's a lot to do with that too, but maybe Chris is extra motivated right now.
I'm sure if you're Chris Boucher right now, there are some mixed feelings.
Right.
I know he doesn't want to go anywhere. He didn't last year when his name was out there. And at one point, it looked kind of like inevitable that the Raptors, and it wasn't for a lack of effort on the Raptors' part, I can tell you that. They were looking to move him last year. The reality was at the time is like, nobody really wanted him at the price that it was going to cost. And when I say like the price, second round pick, the Raptors would have needed to attach something to his deal, considering also that there was another year left on his contract. It wasn't expiring last year. They would have needed to attach something to his deal in order to move it, and they weren't willing to do that, and ultimately he stayed put. He didn't want to go anywhere last year. I know he does not want to go anywhere this year. He loves Toronto. Obviously, he's from Canada.
Yeah.
His son lives here. So I know that was, I talked to him earlier this year about how tough that was for him last year, kind of wrapping his head around the fact that he could be moved and thinking like, oh, how am I going to figure this out with my son? His son is, I think, just turning 2. So logistically, I know he doesn't want to go anywhere. He loves the city. He loves the team. He's the longest serving Raptor, so he's comfortable here. But to your point, like, to know now that teams are looking at him and saying like, okay, well, maybe we were wrong last year. Maybe this is a guy that could help us and that there's actually like value and a marketplace for him right now. That has to make him feel really good. And obviously you'd rather be playing really well if people are shopping you around, if your team is shopping you around than not playing well or not playing at all. And also his contract is expiring. And I'm not sure that there's a long-term future here for him in Toronto. So yeah, like this is a guy, and I wrote this earlier, he's had like 9 lives in the NBA. Every time you count him out, every time he's down, he pops right back and he bounces back up. And he's done that again here. So where there may have been a point where you look at it and say, well, I don't know that he's going to get another deal after this one. I think it's pretty clear now that he will somewhere. And that, to your point, is where I think the motivation lies, is to prove to people that, like, it's 32, but, like, he's a young 32 and he still has something left for sure.
Yeah, it'll be as we approach the deadline, and it could be moves just prior to it, not last minute. It'll be interesting to see some of these names that we've talked about if they remain in Toronto. And it's it's a tough season. Obviously, injuries, not a lot of wins, but they are on a 2-game win streak. With wins against the Warriors and the Celtics and in Milwaukee tonight. So I think there's obviously some more positive vibes around the team right now, and which is nice to see. I wanted to ask one last thing about the Raptors. Really, it's always been interesting to see if they have Canadians on the team, and obviously now we're at a point with the talent in the country and the type of players that are out there. Like now we have a relevant, prominent Canadian in RJ Barrett, for example. That's a major factor. Like, how important is that, do you think, just maybe in the community? He's obviously right from Mississauga, but if it was anyone else as well, like to have a prominent guy from Toronto, from Canada, playing for the team, just community wise, around the organization. Just give me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, playing at home is not for everybody. And I don't just mean like specifically in terms of Canada and Toronto, but like any player around the league playing in their hometown, it can be really challenging. I remember when the Raptors traded for RJ last December, the first call I made was to Corey Joseph, who of course did it himself. And my first question was like, what are those challenges? What does it look like when you first find out? Of course, he signed here. He made the decision to come here. I think it was a sign and trade at the time. Is like, when you make that decision, what's involved? And obviously, like, it's pressure. It's like demand on your time. All of a sudden, people coming out of the woodwork, guys you haven't spoken to, people you haven't spoken to in years, decades, that are hitting you up for tickets. And so, like, multitasking or just kind of just tuning that stuff out and focusing on basketball, like those are the things that you need to do, and not everyone's able to do it. It takes a certain person, certain player, certain personality type to be able to do it. And that was my second question to Corey, was like, you've known RJ for a long time, is he going to be able to do it? And like, no hesitation there. In part because we've already seen him handle something that not every player in the league is able to handle, and that's playing in New York. And he showed that he was able to do that. So now here we are, like just over a year into it, and I've seen and noticed the exact same thing. And so much of this, I would imagine, comes from being raised in a basketball family and Rowan and his impact, and kind of just like, he was born for this. He was born for the pressure and the responsibilities of not just being a professional athlete, but doing something as difficult as playing at home. So I think he's done a really good job in that respect. And I agree with you. Like, I think we've seen Canadians now play for the Raptors for a number of years. There's been really good, like Corey was really good. Chris Boucher is really good. Those players have been important parts of good winning teams. But Masai Ujiri for years was saying, at the time, we kind of thought he was talking about Andrew Wiggins, and I do think he was talking about Andrew Wiggins as like, one day we're going to have the Canadian star here. And I'm not sure that at the time anybody was thinking about it being RJ, but it sort of just happened that way. They made the New York trade at the time. It was for Quickly more than anything else. That's the guy that they wanted. RJ's contract sort of worked, and I do think they looked at it and said, well, it would be great to bring this guy home. And he has exceeded all expectations in terms of what he's been able to do, what he's been. I think some people kind of just pigeonholed him and put him in a box in New York and said, well, this is the player that he is. And at the time he was, I think, like 23. Now he's 24. He's still growing, and he's showing that he's improving as a player. He's gotten a lot better as a playmaker. He still needs to get a lot better defensively, but to say like, this is who the guy is and he's not going to get any better from here is crazy. He's obviously still developing. I do think like there is a decision in the not so distant future that has to be made on him. If you're the Raptors, he's extension eligible, I believe, this summer. You've locked up already the other 2/3 of that young core in Quickly and Barnes. So the Raptors have to make a decision pretty soon in terms of like, is Barrett part of that long-term core? And it's really, really tough to evaluate that right now. As good as Barrett has been, you haven't seen those three together for more than a few games. So it's a difficult decision. Hopefully at some point they're able to get a longer look at those three guys. But RJ has got a few things going for him in addition to the on-court stuff that I mentioned, in the same way that like it was always kind of easy for the Raptors to justify paying DeMar DeRozan, even if at the time you may have thought like, well, this might be a little bit more than he might get elsewhere, or maybe a little bit more than we're comfortable giving him. He's a guy that loved Toronto, wanted to be in this market, and not everybody does. And he's a guy who worked extremely hard. And those are boxes that you can 100% check for RJ. He is a workhorse. He puts in the time, works his tail off, and obviously he wants to be here.
Yeah, well said. And I I don't know if it's maybe the system that Darko and his staff have in place too, and just the other players on the roster, but he's obviously thrived there, and more opportunity, and they've used him, I would say, more properly, I guess, as opposed to the Knicks did. So that's been great to see. And I read one, when he was getting there, and then obviously Kelly later in the year, there's the off-court marketing, sponsorship options for these guys being from Canada. Like we've seen Kelly in a little bit more commercials and whatnot too that go on there. So that's a factor for some of these guys playing at home as well. Josh, can we get into, just your career a little bit, how it took off for you, and just how you got into the broadcasting journalism side? Because obviously I did read the game, you were a fan as well, but just talk about how things got going for you, man.
Yeah, like I think this is something that I knew that I wanted to do from like a very young age. I have been a basketball junkie since I was very young, and like it kind of coincided with, not kind of, it literally coincided with the origins of the Raptors. I was maybe, I think like 7 or 8, I think it was 8 when the Raptors came to be in 95, and they came to Toronto. And I wasn't a sports fan at all at the time, but my dad was really into basketball, is really into basketball. He grew up playing. He was coaching for a while as well. So obviously he was really excited when Toronto and Canada got a team, and we would go to a lot of games. I remember them like pretty well. The SkyDome, not the best place to watch basketball, but at the time, like I didn't know any better. So we're there, like sitting in the like nosebleeds with the binoculars and all of that. I remember being at the game in the inaugural season where they beat the Bulls. And like, I don't know, it was just like, there was something so perfect about it. Obviously, Damon Stoudemire was the star, and he was so relatable at the time, as like, especially as a guy who's like, I've always been, even when I was like younger and playing the game, like I've always been the smallest player on the court when I play. Even like I play rec league, even to this day, every week, and smallest player on the court. So to see Mighty Mouse, like maybe even more than Vince Carter years later, you just like, there was a certain connection that I had with that player and that team and that sport. And then there's also the contrarian in me, where all my friends were like Leafs fans and hockey fans, and I just said like, nah, I'm a basketball guy. So very early on, I knew I wanted to do something in basketball. I love the idea of broadcasting. I just didn't really know how to go about doing it. Now there's like a ton of programs out there, some great schools that are doing it across the country. Like at the time, there wasn't quite as many of them. And then probably just for a lack of effort on my part, I started working doing like retail jobs when I was 15. And for the next like 5, 7, 8 years, I was just like, I was working in banking for a while. I went to school and got a BA in English, and I was thinking like, okay, well, maybe I'm going to be like a writer to some degree. So in the end, like the writing experience helped. But basically I was bouncing around doing things that I wasn't very passionate about. until I decided that this was the thing that I was going to pursue. So I actually did an internship at the Score with Tim McAuliffe at the time, and decided, like, this is really cool. This is what I want to be doing, but I need to actually hone my craft, get some hands-on experience. I went to Centennial College, their sports journalism program, for a year. That's where I met Jim Taddy, who at the time was just starting to work at TSN Radio. TSN Radio had just launched a couple months before I started there in 2011. And so it was a great opportunity. I was interning there at the time. Great opportunity in that, like, there weren't a lot of people there. It just launched. A lot of opportunity for growth. It was actually the NBA lockout year. So they didn't have a Raptors plan. And then in December of that year, when the lockout ended and they realized, like, oh, crap, we need someone to cover the Raptors.
Yeah.
They sent me on kind of like a freelance basis. Like, I think they sent me to the first game. It was a preseason game against Boston. I had to do some live updates on the station. I guess I didn't screw up too badly, because they're like, okay, go back to the second game, go back to the third game. The first year I did freelance. The second year they hired me to do home games and home practices for radio. The third year I was traveling full time, all 82 games with the team. And that was actually the year, that was 2013-14, where they broke through the Rudy Gay trade, that playoff series. They ended the playoff drought, that playoff series against Brooklyn, the iconic F Brooklyn series.
Yeah.
So it was like, it was the perfect time. And then every year since then, like, then I started doing a little bit of writing. Then I added TV, which I wasn't doing initially. So it's been a whirlwind. This is now, I think, season number 14 for me, covering the Raptors for TSN. It's the dream job. It's the job that I kind of grew up wanting to have, and it's still kind of surreal to me.
No, that's awesome. Like, so is radio still like a soft spot for you? Because that was kind of like, a breakthrough, like you said. Like, I know obviously we see you a lot on the Raptors broadcast on TSN now as well, and but yeah, is radio always, and obviously the writing too, because your articles are great too on the website. But like, is radio still kind of your go-to and maybe the soft spot?
It's such a tough industry, as you know, that, like, I always say, the more you can do, the better. So that was always something that's one of the reasons why these programs are really, really good. And Centennial was really good for me, is like to get a little bit of a taste of everything, and to hone, like I was saying earlier, hone your craft in different respects. So I went into that program at Centennial thinking, like, TV is what I wanted to do. But then you do a little bit of writing. And like I said, I did have a background in writing, and I'm like, I kind of enjoy this. I'm pretty good at it. And then radio was something that I never really even considered. But one of the things that I'll recommend to anybody that's either in one of these programs or is thinking about going back to school for it is, like anything else, it's what you make of it. So try and do as much as you can, that extracurricular stuff. Where can I get those reps? So one of the things that I did at the time was I wanted to do a podcast while I was in school. It was a basketball podcast. Actually, funny enough, I was co-hosting with Aaron Korolnik, who has had a ton of success and continues to have a ton of success as the host of the morning show on TSN. So the two of us were doing this podcast and getting these reps. And that's where I really fell in love with podcasting and with radio. And as I said, I got my start there. So you're right. Like, there is certainly always will hold a special place in my heart. I'm happy that it's still a really big part of what I'm doing. And then, yeah, like, to be able to also write and create content on social media and to do TV. The more you can do, the better, I think, at this point in where the industry is at, for sure.
Yeah, it's it's cool. Like, obviously through the podcast, gotten to know some people, and like, for example, Michael Grange from Sportsnet joined us in the first year and developed a friendship with him. And that leads into my next question. Like, this last summer in Vegas at the showcase game for Canada Basketball in the USA, I noticed, like, despite everyone, likely competing for the same story, same soundbite or whatever, but there seems to be a definite camaraderie and community around maybe the Canadian reporters and broadcasters that are covering not only the Raptors but Canada basketball at that time. Like, do you think that's true? Like, is there a sense of that? Because when I walked into, like, after the USAB practice, they opened it up. Like, obviously ESPN, it was just a different animal. But once we were there for Canada at UNLV, it seemed like, and I'm just kind of a supporter, fan, podcaster, but obviously I had a relationship with Mike and a couple others. But I noticed just you and others are just who do this for a living and competing companies. It just still seems to be like a connection and a camaraderie amongst everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very fortunate in that respect, in the sense that, like, you're right, as tough as this industry is, and I talked about it earlier, as competitive as it is, there is this sense of like camaraderie there. First of all, like I work with an exceptional team at TSN that is very close knit. We work together very closely on the Raptors broadcast. My producer, Michael Hamarne, Kia Nurse, Kate Perness, Leo Routens, Kayla Gray, like,
yeah,
we all get along great. And I'm so lucky to have them and their support. And then the people that I work with, that you're right, like, technically we're competing, but it doesn't feel that way. There is a mutual respect there as colleagues, and then also just like a general camaraderie. I wonder how much of it is, I talked about like being the contrarian growing up, of like you're growing up in this hockey town, in this hockey country, and you decide at that point, like, no, like my passion is for basketball. And I'll be the first to admit, like, as a basketball fan growing up, especially when I did, like, there's just this chip on your shoulder where, like, you don't feel like, and that's, I guess, where the slogan "We the North" came from, and why it's had so much success, is you just don't feel like the sport is getting enough love or enough attention in this space. And obviously that has changed quite a bit over the last few decades. But I think what all of us have in common, whether we're writing for the newspapers or over there at Sportsnet or TSN, all of us have a passion for this sport, probably for this team as well. We all grew up to some degree as basketball fans and basketball people. And I do think like there's a mutual admiration there because of that. So yeah, like even something, I'll give you an example, is after a scrum, after a press conference, we'll split up the transcription. We have a transcription doc where like 6 or 7 of us will split up the work, so that rather than each of us having to go through and transcribe the exact same thing, we're working together to make sure that we're all able to like get that document, get that transcription. It's all a little bit easier for us. So I do think there's that teamwork there that you don't often see. And I do, like, I can't speak from experience because I covered the Jays a tiny bit, like on a freelance basis when I started at TSN Radio. Never covered hockey, covered a few other things. But even just from like hearing stories, I don't get the sense that the other beats in this city or even beats in other cities have that same level of togetherness and camaraderie and closeness. So I'm happy that you noticed that and that you pointed that out for sure. Because it's something that, like, yeah, I think maybe I take for granted sometimes because I don't know what the other side looks like. But I have been very fortunate in that respect from day one. I mean, I remember when I was just starting out, when I was just traveling for the first time, vets like Doug Smith and Michael Grange, as you mentioned, a few others really taking me under their wing, and they didn't have to do that. So I'm very, very appreciative.
Yeah, it was sort of noticeable in a sense, I guess. Maybe looking at it now, like, there's also the Canadian pride. Like, I think everyone, recovering the senior men's national team in Vegas there and leading up to Paris. But it was, I think everyone was hoping these guys would do well just for representing the country as well, right? And pretty likable group. So it seemed like there was a lot of connection amongst yourself and others that were covering the team. That's a good segue. Let's get into the Canada basketball stuff. And obviously, the senior men's national team, the last 2 summers with Paris and the World Cup, and the success in the World Cup with the bronze. What do you make of maybe this team and this program and this core of players right now, Josh? I mean, you you see them throughout this NBA season and cover them in that respect too. But just give me maybe your overall synopsis of the group right now. We got another couple summers to go to the next major tournament with the World Cup. But just what do you think about this program right now?
They're in a really good spot, and I think they're really, really close to where I think a lot of people think that they can be, where they want to be, where I think they will end up being. I can understand why some longtime Canadian basketball fans might be frustrated in hearing me say that they're close, because like the devil's advocate side of me is like, okay, well, we've been saying they're close for like over a decade now. Golden era of Canada basketball. We've said it a few times before, and they've come up short, or they've come up shorter than where we thought that they were at the time. So like, why are they that much closer now? And like, what I would say to that is just like, to get from where they were to where they ultimately want to go, and again, where I think that they can and will go, like, that's not easy. That is a process that takes a number of different steps. And I think we've seen them take those steps. Like, there was a point where there just weren't enough high-level Canadian players, certainly not NBA caliber Canadian players, to even fill out a team. Then they go out and they develop those guys. They get those guys. All of a sudden, Canada has a number of high-level NBA players. But then the next hurdle was like, how do you convince these guys to want to play for their country? There was a while where everyone was asking, well, like, why aren't these guys playing? Then they actually go out and they convince those guys to play. But then the next hurdle is like, okay, well, the team looks different every summer. You've got these NBA players that are just coming in last minute. There's no chemistry. There's no continuity. And that's ultimately where they're getting burned. So then the next step was like, okay, well, how do you solve that? And they have. Like, this last window, they found a way to get the commitments from the best players the country has to offer. They built that chemistry. They built that continuity. And then now, like, that last hurdle, which is not nothing, it's also significant, is like getting the reps, getting the experience. Because as we saw in the Olympics last summer, it was a new experience. It was the first experience for everybody on that team, going up against teams and countries who, in a lot of cases, had that experience before. And oftentimes, like, that's what it takes. And we see it at every level, like in the NBA too. I'll use Shea as an example, because even last year in the playoffs, like, he and his team hadn't really been through that. And now that they have, like, I think from an NBA standpoint, people are looking at the Thunder this year and saying, like, okay, well, now they're battle tested. So in the same way that we say that with Shea as an NBA player, I'm going to say that about Shea as an international player, as a FIBA player, as an Olympian, as well as some of these other guys. Any of them that are back, knock on wood, hopefully when and if Canada qualifies for the LA games, like, they've now had that experience. So I think they're doing exactly what they need to be doing. I think they're exactly where they want, where you would want them to be. And the fact that you have a number of guys, but certainly the best guy in Shea, that still to this day says that he's committed, isn't just saying it because you can feel and sense that, like, passion and excitement to continue to represent his country. They're in a really, really good spot.
No, I agree. And, like, as a person that's followed the program for a long time, like, I was, hooked on the 2000 games when, with Rowan Barrett, Steve Nash, and others. And the major difference now is the program did a great job creating buy-in from guys, despite, obviously a lot of commitment and responsibility to their pro career, establishing, the summer core, the winter core to get the qualification completed for the World Cup, which led to the qualification for the Olympics. But the talent is deeper and better, and there's a desire when you have a leader like Shea that is the first guy to raise his hand and is clearly the country's best player. That goes a long way. And I think being battle tested from the Olympics and the disappointment of it, I think it's created a lot of hunger and drive for the guys to play better and get a better result in LA. And they just the program's gotten better funding and better leadership under the CEO Michael Bartlett, a friend of ours, um, and we're at the point now too, I think, where they can take that roster and as they approach the next World Cup and the Olympics, if they needed to make a few tweaks based on availability, like you look at a guy like Zach Edey, who would have helped this team in Paris, no question, given how his play has gone in Memphis when he's been healthy. And, they're going to have an interesting roster decision in 3 or 4 years' time as well. So, I love your insight. I think, across the board defensively, it can be a really tough group. A friend of ours on Twitter today, or X, Scott Witter, who's a great follow for Canada Basketball stuff, just talking about, defensively when Andrew Nemhard is improving as a defender and improving his play, and you put him alongside Lou Dort and even Shea and Nikhil, like it's a really tough group that's going to cause a lot of problems. And did you think there was a guy that didn't play this last summer in Paris that could have maybe made a difference based on, the result? Like we all know Jamal Murray wasn't fully healthy. Andrew Wiggins had to step aside. Do you think there was a guy at the forefront that would have made a difference in some ways?
I think maybe the biggest guy, literally, is the one that you mentioned is Edey. If for no other reason than like, if you're looking at this pool of players that Canada has to work with now, which I agree is like deeper than ever, more versatile than ever. They've got a lot of guys to choose from. The one area of obvious weakness, and it was a topic of conversation going into Paris and ended up playing out in Paris, is like the lack of depth and size in the front court, especially compared to some of these other countries, and certainly going up against France. And they didn't even really use Rudy Gobert in that game, but obviously Wemby and the size that they have, the size that the Americans had, like that's really what hurt them. And it just so happens that there aren't a lot of great Canadian bigs right now. Tristan Thompson is obviously getting up there in age. Brandon Clark would be nice too, but they just don't have that same level of depth that they do in the backcourt, obviously, where there are so many great guards and obviously a lot of really great wings right now. So to have that size in Zach Edey really would have been nice. And just like in the NBA, like I'm not sure that he's still as good as he is. Like he's still a bit of a situational player where there are going to be situations in the NBA or in FIBA where teams go small and maybe run Edey off the court. But I still think like for a guy that's that talented and that big and that dominant, you're going to be in an advantageous position more than you're going to be at a disadvantage. So, look, it always seemed really unlikely that he was going to be able to play, and I was surprised leading up to camp that he was on that list, even as a possibility, just based on like, we almost never see rookies, guys that are just like coming out of the draft, able to commit to playing, because there's just so much that needs to be done going into your first NBA season. And obviously your responsibility is to the team that drafted you. He was a top 10 pick. And I know that like being in summer league, being in Memphis, like all of that was really, really important for him. So I wasn't surprised. I wasn't really disappointed in that. Like I understood it. But the good news is like this is one of the many players that sound like fully bought in, fully on board with playing for Canada. There's no like, oh, we'll see if everything aligns, the stars align and all of that. Like he's going to play, assuming that he's healthy and everything is all sorted from a contract standpoint. So he's a guy I think they're really going to need, if for no other reason than just the lack of bigs right now in the pool.
Yeah, agreed. And obviously there's going to be some guys that just won't be there based on age and point of careers. And I think maybe of like a Kelly Olynyk, Dwight Powell, vets that maybe just missed their last opportunity. So there's obvious spots that are going to open up, and we'll have to see what's who's available come I guess in 2027 for the World Cup, and then the Olympics a year later. Okay, Josh, I like to ask guests kind of who their top favorite five is for Canada basketball, but I guess in your role, in your job, like who for five, who do you love interviewing, covering, just dealing with, talking with, getting sound bites from, man?
It's interesting, like covering Canada basketball in the sense that like media isn't a required part of the gig in the same way that it is for players in the NBA, where it's literally in the contract, and obviously you're getting paid a lot of money in the NBA. The league really, really enforces it for obvious reasons. And when you're volunteering essentially to play for your country over the summer, it doesn't quite have the same level of obligation. And obviously, like Canada basketball, not to the same point that it used to, but like the program is just so grateful, I think, that as they should be, that the NBA players are showing up and participating, that there isn't a lot of pushback there.
Right.
It still happens to some degree. So it really tests the players, I think, to see like, okay, well, how much do you want to do media? And you find out, I think, a lot about the players and the people in that situation when it's not required. And what I like to see is like after a loss, after a really, really bad loss, and Canada has had a number of them over the years, after an elimination game, who is there? Who shows up? Who is willing to talk to the media, take accountability when they don't have to? So I was in Mexico City in 2015. Of course, that did not go well. And it was a talented team led by Andrew Wiggins. Two players spoke after that really brutal loss to Venezuela. Corey Joseph, Kelly Olynyk, and like they're 100% of my top five.
Nice.
Corey isn't like the best quote, but he's one of the best people, not just professional athletes or basketball players, one of my favorite people that I've ever worked around. Just like a stand-up class act, always so generous with his time. Like I said, was really helpful with the RJ stuff, and just over the years, whether he was playing for the Raptors or not, Kelly's been great since getting to the Raptors. I'll put RJ in there too, just because like I think he's so polished, and that comes from Rowan's influence, sometimes maybe to a fault, because he's trained enough and smart enough to know when not to say things too. So that can be frustrating sometimes, but no, he's really personable and really like respectful too. I think really thoughtful in his responses. From a Raptors standpoint, I really appreciated, I think it was 2 weeks ago, the game against Milwaukee, a really bad loss, the first time that they were healthy. He was the guy that said, as honest and as direct as I've heard anyone this year say, like, this is unacceptable. So those three guys come to mind. I'm working backwards here, but the guy at the absolute top of my list, because I mentioned guys that are like pretty good quotes, the guy who is like A+ quote, A+ insight, generous with his time, despite the fact that he doesn't have to be right now, because he is at the absolute top of the sport, an MVP caliber player. And soon we can eliminate the word caliber player and just say an MVP is Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who is like such a unicorn in terms of a superstar in basketball, because a lot of the time you associate like that level of play with like the ego and being a bit of a prima donna, tough to deal with. Not the case at all with Shai. Like super humble, super down to earth, really thoughtful with his answers and his insight. And again, I wasn't in Paris for the Olympics. Unfortunately, not a lot of us Canadians reporters were, but my understanding is that he was one of those guys after the loss to France to really stand up and take accountability. And that's not surprising to me at all. And then I guess I need a fifth guy, and I'll stay in the family because I guess it's in the blood, is Nikhil is really great as well. And I would say, like, unlike Shai, who has, I mean, obviously he kind of started a little bit at the bottom as well with the Clippers and has worked his way up to the caliber player that he is right now. But I think Nikhil has such a unique perspective just based on like bouncing around as much as he has and being in so many different positions and essentially playing for his life in the NBA, playing for his future. Like he just has a really interesting perspective on the game that he's so generous with like sharing with us. So I've really enjoyed speaking to him over the years as well.
Man, you you mentioned guys that like Corey and Kelly, for example, like in my top 5, right? It has nothing to do with interviews, just because of what they've given to the program.
Yeah.
I ran into Corey in Victoria when they were doing the qualifier for the World Cup at the airport the next morning, and just spent a minute chatting, and he is just a good dude, right? And so, and I've grown to really love Nikhil too, in the sense that yeah, just having a competing battle to stay in the league. And, he did a good interview post shoot around game day in Vegas.
Yeah.
He's well spoken. He's got a great outlook on the game, I think, and his role in it, whether it's playing for the Timberwolves or Canada Basketball. And Shea, same thing, he's humble, and just been around him a couple times too. And yeah, just makes time for people. And I think he understands the importance of it and that role, and has accepted it, embraced it. So
Honorable
great.
mention to Lew and Dylan too, who are great. And then Dwight Powell is one of the smartest, not just basketball players, but like humans that I've ever spoken to. And he's really good as well.
No, it's cool, right? And I think the program is very fortunate, right? There's guys that want to represent it, buy in, play for it, and they're a great group of people. And great insight, man. I love that. Hey, Josh, any shout outs or thank yous before I get you out of here? And again, really appreciate this, and it's been a lot of fun, man.
No, my pleasure. I've been a fan for a long time. I've been a listener for a long time, and I love talking hoops. I love talking Canada basketball and Raptors. So this has been a lot of fun, and I'm here anytime, available anytime, and hope we can chat again soon.
Yeah, we appreciate that. That's a wrap on another episode of Canada Hoops. I want to thank Josh Lewenberg for pulling up. Thank you for listening. Remember to rate and review us wherever you get your podcast. Check out our YouTube channel. Hit us up on Instagram and X.com, and we will see you on the next episode.